Hi guys, this is Brianna and I'll be talking about Chapter 13, the Peripheral Nervous System. The peripheral nervous system is all neural structures that are not the brain and spinal cord. First, we will briefly talk about sensory receptors and how they are classified. There are 3 ways to classify. The first is stimulus they detect, the second is location, and the third is structural complexity. Starting off with mechanoreceptors, they recept mechanical force. Next is thermoreceptors. They recept temperature changes. Third, we have photoreceptors, and they recept light. Next, we have chemoreceptors, and they recept chemicals. And last, we have nociceptors, which are our pain receptors. There are 3 ways to classify sensory receptors by their location. The first is exteroceptors, which are outside of the body. The second is interoceptors, which are internal viscera and blood vessels. And the last is proprioceptors, which are internal as well, but they are joints, muscles, tendons, and they tell you where you are in space. The next way to classify sensory receptors is by their structural complexity. These 3 are simple non-encapsulated. The first is free nerve endings, and they are present in nearly everywhere in the body and most body tissues. The next is a modified free nerve ending called Merkel discs, and they are in the basal layer of the epidermis. The next is root hair plexus, which is also a modified free nerve ending, and they are present near hair follicles. Next, we move on to the encapsulated nerve endings. These all consist of 1 or more fiber terminals or sensory neurons enclosed in a connective tissue capsule. Tactile or messenger corpuscles are exteroceptors and mechanoreceptors. They're beneath the dermis in the dermal papillae and are common in sensitive and hairless skin areas. Lamellar or Pacinian corpuscles are exteroceptors, interoceptors, and sometimes proprioceptors. They are also mechanoreceptors. They are scattered mostly in the dermis, in the subcutaneous tissue underlying the skin. Bulbous corpuscles are exteroceptors, proprioceptors, and mechanoreceptors. They are deep in the dermis, hypodermis, and joint capsules. Muscle spindles are proprioceptors and mechanoreceptors. They are in skeletal muscles. Tendon organs are proprioceptors and mechanoreceptors and are found in tendons. And lastly, joint kinesthetic receptors are proprioceptors and mechanoreceptors, and they are in joint capsules of synovial joints. Nerves are also classified according to the direction in which they transmit impulses. Afferent or sensory nerves carry impulses only towards the central nervous system. Efferent or motor nerves carry impulses only away from the central nervous system. Mixed nerves contain both sensory and motor fibers, and they can transmit impulses both to and from the central nervous system. Before we look at nerves, we need to look at the neuron. What we're focusing on is the axon and the myelin sheath. The axon conducts impulses which move from the cell body along the axon down to other cells. The myelin sheath wraps around the axon and allows electrical impulses to transmit quickly and efficiently down the axon. Now that we've talked about the myelin sheath and the axon, now we can move on to the endoneurium. The endoneurium is a delicate layer of loose connective tissue that surrounds each axon. The perineurium is a more dense connective tissue that binds groups of axons together into bundles called fascicules. The epineurium is a tough fibrous sheath that encloses all the fascicules to form a nerve. In the peripheral nervous system, if there is damage to a nervous tissue but the cell body remains intact, axons can regenerate themselves. This is not the same case in the central nervous system. Regeneration of the nerve axons starts with the axon fragments. Degeneration of the distal end of the cut axon, called Wallerian degeneration, spreads down the axon. In step 2, Schwann cells and macrophages clean out the dead axon distal to the injury. In step 3, Schwann cells start forming a regeneration tube where the axon filaments grow through the tube. Nerves can be classified by their origin. There are cranial and spinal nerves. The cranial nerves are associated with the brain, and there are 12 pairs. The spinal nerves are, of course, associated with the spine. There are 31 pairs, and each nerve contains thousands of nerve fibers that arise from the spinal cord and supply all parts of the body except for the head and some of the neck. Nerves 1 and 2 are not mixed, meaning they only have one function and it is a sensory function. Nerves 3 through 12 are mixed, meaning they have a sensory and motor function. And nerve number 10 is its own special nerve. All of the cranial nerves only serve in the head and neck structures, but cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, extends past the head and neck into the abdomen. The first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. Its sensory function is smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. Its sensory function is vision. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor nerve. Its function is eye and eyelid movement. The fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve. Its function is eye movement. Yes, eye movement again. The fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve. Its function is general sensation, and it contains 3 divisions. The ophthalmic division conveys sensory impulses from the scalp, upper eyelid, and nose. The maxillary division conveys sensory impulses from the nasal cavity, palate, upper teeth, skin of cheek, upper lip, and lower eyelid. And the mandibular division conveys sensory impulses from anterior tongue, lower teeth, skin of chin, temporal region of scalp. The sixth cranial nerve is the abducens nerve. Its function is eye movement again. The seventh cranial nerve is the facial nerve. Its function is facial expression, crying, salivary gland, and taste for anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The eighth cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Its function is hearing and equilibrium. The ninth cranial nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Its functions are gag reflex, swallowing, and taste for posterior 2/3 of the tongue. The 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the special cranial nerve that we talked about before. It is the only cranial nerve to extend past the head and neck and down to the abdomen. Its function is parasympathetic innervation. These parasympathetic motor fibers supply heart, lungs, and abdominal viscera and are involved in regulating heart rate, breathing, and digestive system activity. The 11th cranial nerve is the accessory nerve. This function is head and neck movement. The 12th cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. Its function is tongue movement. Spinal nerves are named from where they originate on the spinal cord. The first 8 are cervical nerves. The next 12 are thoracic. The next 5 are lumbar. The next 5 are sacral, and the last one is coccygeal. The dorsal root ganglion is also known as the posterior root ganglion, which is a cluster of neurons in a dorsal root of the spinal nerve. In the peripheral nervous system, the dorsal root ganglia help transmit the sensory messages of pain and touch. There are 4 types of branches or rami of spinal nerves. The first one is the dorsal ramus, the second is the ventral ramus, the third is the meningeal branch, and the fourth is rami communicanes. The dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus are very much related to the dorsal and ventral root. Where they meet is where the spinal nerve is formed. The meningeal branch is small and re-enters the vertebral canal so it can innervate the meninges and the blood vessels within the meninges. The last rami is the rami communicanes. It's special because it contains autonomic nerve fibers that attach the ventral rami of the thoracic spinal nerves. Now moving on to the plexi of ventral rami, there's 4 types: cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Starting with the cervical plexus, it is the plexus of the anterior rami of the first 4 cervical spinal nerves, and it transmits sensory impulses from the skin of the neck. The brachial plexus is situated in the neck and partly the axilla. It involves all the nerves that innervate the upper limb. The third plexus is the lumbar plexus. It originates from spinal nerves lumbar 1 through 4 and innervates in the abdominal wall muscles, but can also innervate down to the anterior and medial thigh. The sacral plexus arises from spinal nerves lumbar 4 through sacral 4. The sacral plexus is large and has about a dozen named branches. Half of them serve the buttock and the lower limb. The others innervate pelvic structures and the perineum. There are many branches in the sacral plexus, but these are just a few of the main and important ones. The sciatic nerve is the thickest and longest nerve in the body. There are 5 components to a reflex arc. The first is the receptor. This is where the site of the stimulus action is. The second is the sensory neuron. This transmits afferent impulses into the CNS. The third is the integration center, which contains a single synapse between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. 4 is the motor neuron, which conducts efferent impulses away from the CNS into an effector organ. And the effector is the muscle fiber or gland cell that responds to the efferent impulses. The first somatic spinal reflex is stretch. It involves skeletal muscle, and there's 2 types of information needed to be able to coordinate it smoothly, which is length and tension. The next somatic spinal reflex is the deep tendon reflex. This has the opposite effect as the stretch reflex. When there is tension, it relaxes and lengthens. The next somatic spinal reflex is the flexor reflex. This is initiated by a painful stimulus, and it gives a withdrawal effect where there is an automatic withdrawal of the threatened body part from the stimulus, as if you touched a hot stove and you immediately pull your hand back. The next somatic spinal reflex is the cross-extensor reflex. It often goes hand in hand with the flexor reflex, but it is in larger limbs. It also is very important in maintaining balance. The superficial somatic spinal reflexes are elicited by gentle cutaneous stimulation. The plantar reflex involves lumbar 4 through sacral 2. You can draw a blunt object down along the lateral aspect of the plantar surface of the foot to elicit this reflex. If the primary cortex of the plantar reflex is damaged, it is then replaced by Babinski's sign, where the great toe dorsiflexes and the smaller toes fan laterally. The abdominal reflex is very interesting. When there's a stimulus of stroking the skin on any part of the abdomen, you can see that the abdominal muscles contract and the umbilicus moves towards the stimulated site. The autonomic spinal reflexes are talked about in later chapters, but for now we need to know that they involve the viscera. And that is the peripheral nervous system.